Welcome to today's Energy Central webcast entitled, How to Implement a Successful Price-Based Demand Response Program. A few housekeeping notes we'd like to mention. For best results in viewing this presentation, we recommend using a wired high-speed internet connection, as wireless connections can be unpredictable. If you cannot get adequate sound from your computer speakers, you may dial into the audio portion using the telephone number listed in the right-hand panel of your interface under the audio section. Following the presentation, we'll have a brief question and answer period. You may submit your questions at any time using the interface on your screen. I'm happy to introduce today's panel. We have Evan Pittman, Associate Director, Corporate Strategy at Converge, and David Eggert, Energy Efficient Supervisor at Gulf Power. Now I'm happy to turn the floor over to our first speaker, Evan Pittman. Evan, welcome to the event. You have the floor and should have controls.
Thanks, PJ. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. As PJ said, my name is Evan Pittman. I'm an Associate Director in our Corporate Strategy Group here at Converge. Before I joined Converge about a year ago, I was at University of Chicago for my MBA, and before that with the Brattle Group for a few years in their electricity consulting practice. I'm pleased to be joined today by David Eggert, longtime friend of Converge with 30-plus years of experience in the utility industry. He's the Energy Efficiency Supervisor at Gulf Power, based out of Pensacola, Florida. Together, we're going to give you guys an overview today of how to successfully design and implement a price-based demand response program. So I'm going to kick us off with a higher-level overview of some of the topics, and then I'm going to pass it over to David to go through in some detail the success they've had in implementing their time of use and critical peak pricing program, Energy Select. For those of you who aren't familiar with Converge, we are a full-service demand response, energy efficiency, and customer engagement solution provider. We're focused on the residential and small commercial customer segments and have about 6 gigawatts of demand response in those segments under control across the country. So before I dive into the topic today, I do want to provide some clarity around terminology. So most of you on the call, I'm sure, hear a lot of the buzzwords that are flying around today around utility pricing. We've titled the webinar Price-Based Demand Response, but we really view that as an all-inclusive term for all of these different approaches, whether it's time of use or demand charges or peak time rebates. All of it is really what we consider to be cost-reflective pricing. So the point of cost-reflective pricing being to charge customers more for those actions that lead to higher cost to serve and charging customers less for those actions that reduce the cost to serve them. And another terminology note, I'll be using the term electric utilities throughout this presentation. A lot of what I'm saying, though, applies equally to retail electric providers and competitive suppliers as well. So to kind of motivate our discussion today, why should electric utilities bother tying rates to costs? And I want to highlight 3 important reasons. The first, and perhaps the most important, is that tying rate structures to cost structures incentivizes customers to behave in ways that lower system costs. So by aligning these incentives you make in the course of a customer acting in their own self-interest to lower their bill, they're acting in the broader interest of the grid as well and lowering costs for everyone. So you can drive reduced system peak demand, you can avoid expensive energy purchases, you can even reduce the amount of cost you spend on distribution infrastructure. The second key motivation is empowering customers to manage their energy bill. So under the prevailing paradigm of a flat rate per kilowatt hour, customers have not that many options, frankly, for how to reduce their bill. They can reduce their total consumption, but that's about it. If you start to move to more granular rates, customers have more options. Perhaps it's easier for someone to avoid using a major appliance during the day and shift that to night, instead of eliminating using that appliance at all in the first place. The third motivator I want to highlight is that cost-reflective pricing helps allocate costs fairly across customers. And I think we all know that's becoming a hot button issue today with distributed energy resources showing up big time on the grid. There's a lot of debate around who should pay what. So we'll keep those in mind as we move through the presentation. Those are really the motivators and the benefits of these cost structures. I want to dive in next to a little overview of what the utility cost structure is. And this is going to be an oversimplified discussion, and it's going to be review for a lot of you, but I want to make sure we have a clear framework that we all agree on so we can start to make some sense out of all of these different rate design options that are floating around today. So of course, utility costs typically divide up into three major buckets: generation, transmission, and distribution. And I just pulled the latest data from the EIA to show how the average bill in the U.S. as of late divides amongst those three parts of the value chain. And generation dominates with a 65% share of cost, and distribution accounts for another 26%. So together, these two account for over 90% of the cost on average of delivered electricity. And so I'm going to focus on those two cost buckets today and leave transmission for another time. So diving deeper into those two buckets that I wanted to focus on, first is the generation costs. And so what really drives that? I've bucketed it here into two categories. The first is the short-run variable costs. So these are things like fuel, variable operations and maintenance, etc. These are often referred to as the energy costs. In ISO markets, this is all encapsulated in the locational marginal price, or the LMP. But the key insight on these costs is that they're driven by hourly demand. So in a particular, or often intervals even shorter than an hour, but I'll say hourly as a shortcut today. As demand increases in a particular hour, of course, these costs increase, but they also increase at the margin. So you move to more and more expensive units that drive even higher costs. It's not a linear relationship. So that's one big component of the generation cost driver. The other is, of course, the capacity cost, or the cost of actually building generation infrastructure. And these, unlike energy costs, are fixed in the short run, i.e. tomorrow we're going to be stuck with the same power plants that we have built today. But they are variable in the long run. Every year we're making planning decisions about what infrastructure to build for the future, and that decision is driven by system peak demand. So again, I'm emphasizing here what the drivers are, because that's ultimately what we want to tie prices to if we want to drive behavior that reduces these costs. So hourly demand for energy and system peak demand for capacity decisions. Over on the distribution side, there's not much in the way of short-run variable costs like there is in the generation cost driver side. And I'm sure there are some examples that prove me wrong, but I think we agree that the bulk of the costs really are more variable only in the long run, and they're driven by meeting peak delivery needs. But in contrast with generation capacity drivers, they're really driven by very localized needs on the network. So you might need to build out a particular circuit to meet what you expect to be peak demand on that one circuit, rather than peak demand on the system as a whole. The final bucket of costs I want to highlight under distribution is fixed costs. And these are things like maintenance and meter reads and corporate overhead. And there's no cost driver for this item, at least in terms of energy use. Some of these costs might be driven by number of customers on the network, but it's not driven by the number of kilowatt hours that are consumed or the peak kilowatt demand. So thanks for bearing with me through that. I know that's review for a lot of folks in the industry. Moving on, though, we can use these four cost buckets now to start to build a framework to think about all these different rate structures that are out there. And so I'm going to walk through what some of these rate structures are. And again, I know a lot of you will be familiar with them, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So let me walk through these quickly. First, I've categorized three different rate structures under that address the variable energy cost drivers, so that address energy consumption on from hour to hour on the system. These, starting at the bottom here of this graphic, is sort of the simplest implementation of these types of rates, and that's time of use pricing. So typically under a time of use rate structure, a utility far in advance defines what its peak periods are going to be and what its off-peak periods are going to be, and also sets what the rates are going to be during those periods, well in advance, let's say the beginning of a season or even further in advance. And so you see here on this chart, we've demonstrated what these different rates would look like on a low demand day, perhaps a medium demand day, and a high demand day. And TOU doesn't vary from day to day. It really reflects what you expect your average peak price to be versus your average off-peak price. Taking it one step more granular, you have the variable peak pricing option, which like TOU defines periods in advance, but leaves some flexibility in setting what the peak price is going to be on a given day. So a utility might look day ahead and look at day-ahead power prices and decide energy prices and decide that they're going to set their VPP rate to reflect the average peak for tomorrow, and they'd communicate that with customers. Taking it a step even more granular and directly tied to cost is the real-time pricing cost structure, and here rates can vary by the hour or even by 15-minute intervals to reflect real-time LMP on the system or real-time marginal cost in those non-ISO territories. Moving to the next bucket of cost structures or rate structures that help address the drivers of generation capacity cost, specifically system peak demand. I want to highlight two options here. And the first is critical peak pricing. This is a departure from the first two energy cost rate structures in that the utility really calls events under this pricing structure. So they're not determining long in advance when the peak periods are going to be. They're looking day ahead or even day of at when they expect peaks to occur on their system or shortages to occur. And they're calling these events when they see that coming. When they do call the events, they're usually a few hours in duration, and prices rise to very high levels during those events. So if you think of TOU, you might expect that to range anywhere from 5 cents off peak to 25 cents on peak. With critical peak pricing, you're talking more in the range of 70 cents a kilowatt hour to $1 a kilowatt hour or higher. The close cousin of CPP is the peak time rebate or PTR. That, again, the utility calls events under this structure, but here instead of the price rising very high, customers are eligible to receive rebates for reductions in their consumption against some baseline. So the utility will look at what they expect that customer to consume during that period and then pay them for any reduction from that expectation. You might be wondering why would customers ever opt for CPP over PTR? One answer is that typically CPP is associated with much lower prices in all other periods, whereas PTR is layered on top of existing rates that reflect kind of an average cost and thus are higher. Moving on then to rate structures that address distribution cost concerns, in particular peak-driven distribution costs. There's a lot of discussion out there today on moving towards demand charges for customers. And so I want to highlight that there's two flavors that are talked about under demand charges. The first is sort of a local customer level demand charge, and that would be as simple as looking back at a customer's, at the end of a billing period, looking back at a customer's interval consumption over that billing period and identifying the highest 15 or 30-minute period and charging a customer based on their kilowatts of demand during that period. Contrast that to more of a coincident peak demand charge option, and that involves not looking back just at an individual customer's metering data and finding the maximum interval, but rather looking at when and there's a lot of flavors of this, but either where perhaps a circuit peak was met or where a network peak was met and charging the customer based on their demand during that hour or period. The latter is really probably more closely tied to cost, but it introduces some complications in terms of communicating the rate to the customers. You either have to flag in advance which periods you expect to be those peaks, or the customer essentially has to guess at it, and you have to settle up after the fact. So obviously some challenges to think about there. The final bucket I won't focus in on, it's just the fixed cost, and since there's no cost driver per se there's nothing you really want to tie those costs to other than a fixed monthly charge on customer bills. So the question now that we've been through all the tools in the cost-reflected pricing toolbox, and I'm sure there's several that I omitted as well, the question is, what do you choose when you're looking to design a cost-reflected pricing rate structure? And I think it's important to think of it in the following terms, and that's that there's unfortunately somewhat of an intrinsic trade-off between designing rates that are simple to understand and rates that are highly reflective of your cost drivers. And that's not to say there's not a balance to be struck, but I think there's necessarily that trade-off that you have to consider in any rate design. And so I've given some examples here on the spectrum. To the far left end, a flat price per kilowatt hour, kind of the prevailing status quo, is obviously customers are used to that. It's very easy to articulate, but it's very much not reflective of cost for the reasons we've just talked about. So contrast that to the far right side of the spectrum, where you might layer a real-time pricing energy charge on top of a coincident demand charge for distribution costs on top of a monthly fixed charge. Obviously, that's a lot harder for the customer to understand. I hope if you implement a rate like that, your marketing team will come up with a better name for it than I have here. But there's compromises to be struck, of course, in the middle somewhere. And so an example is combining a time of use rate with a critical peak pricing rate. And that's the option we tend to go for in price-based demand response programs that we implement. And David will share more information with you guys in a few minutes on their time of use and critical peak pricing program. So where you end up on this spectrum is going to depend on your individual circumstances. And we're happy to have conversations one-on-one with anyone to think through this and think what might be most appropriate given a particular circumstance. But I do want to highlight a few general arguments for what might make you lean to the left of the spectrum versus to the right of the spectrum. And reasons to lean to the left, arguments for simplicity include if you're designing an opt-in program, you must keep in mind that you're going to have to recruit customers to voluntarily join this program. And so if a rate's a little bit too complicated, you might struggle to recruit customers into the program and thus might have a less successful program than you would otherwise. Another thought is that if rates are far too complicated, they may backfire by causing customer frustration or making customers not understand even how to respond. And thus, get less reaction from your customers. So we'll talk about ways to mitigate that risk factor on the next slide. But before I go there, wanted to suggest a few reasons you might push towards the right side of this spectrum, and really they're the reasons we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, which are the more reflective of your costs you make your pricing structure, the more action you're going to get that's going to reduce system costs, and the more options you're going to give customers to manage their own bill. Another consideration that might push you towards more complicated rate structures is if you're designing an opt-out program or a default rate. Because you don't have the barrier of making customers act to opt in, you may be able to get away with something a little more complicated and thus in some ways a little more beneficial. Of course, I could hear arguments against that as well in terms of rolling out very complicated rates to a large swath of your customers. But those are some factors to consider. So I promised that we'd address ways to mitigate customer confusion and acceptance. And frankly, this is an issue you're going to have to deal with if you choose any rate structure that's to the right of the very far left of that spectrum, i.e. anything more complicated than a flat kilowatt hour rate. So there's three approaches that we want to highlight for ensuring that you get good customer acceptance and good customer satisfaction in a program. And the first is ensuring that you're targeting the right customers in the right way. So a couple of suggestions here. One option is to use meter data or device data if you have devices in customer homes to identify customers who are most likely to benefit from these rates and reach out to them and drive satisfaction through your program that way. That is, most likely to benefit based on their existing load profile. Another important approach is to segment your customers to ensure that you're delivering the most effective marketing message possible. Some customers are going to respond more to financial messages that you can save X amount on your bill. Other customers are going to respond more to green messages or pitching in and doing your part to help keep the lights on type messages. So we'll share some more resources in our follow-up email from this webinar on appropriate ways to segment customers and craft your messaging to those different segments. The second factor that I want to highlight or approach to driving acceptance is providing appropriate coaching to customers. So naturally, if customers are enrolled into a more complicated to understand rate, they're going to look to the utility for advice on how to manage that rate. And so there's two flavors here as well. There's tips that you might give a customer when they enroll to help them get the sense of how this program works. So say you're enrolling a customer onto a real-time pricing program, you might give them a general tip like energy prices tend to vary with temperature outside. So on hot afternoons, try to conserve, try to delay use of appliances, etc., until the evening when it cools off. But perhaps more important than that is targeted and real-time coaching. So let's say you've got a critical peak pricing program. It's important, for example, to consider messaging your customers on the morning that you're going to call a critical peak pricing event and give them actionable suggestions for how they can prepare for that event and how they can save money. The final driver that I want to highlight for customer acceptance is automating price response wherever possible. So that is, for example, providing customers a thermostat or installing a switch on their water heater or pool pump that can respond automatically to pricing events. And also you can take advantage of Wi-Fi connected appliances that the customer might have in their home. This is important for the customer and beneficial to the customer because they save money without taking any action or any extra responsibility. And it's important for the utility too because it turns a pricing program into a reliable, predictable capacity resource. So for example, it can, in the PJM market, in their price responsive demand program, it's a requirement that there be some kind of automation in place in association with the pricing structure. So there you become eligible to enroll it in PJM's emergency response program, and it gives peace of mind to the utility and insight into the amount of load they have available, even if they're operating outside of an organized ISO market. Following up on that, I want to highlight share some data with you here. This is courtesy of the Brattle Group. They maintain a large database of pricing trials around the country and the world. And here they've highlighted trials where they divided customers into two groups. One group that received only a pricing treatment and another group that received the pricing treatment plus some sort of enabling technology. So in this case, I think the majority of these are automation. It also includes some enabling technologies that are more focused on information, so like in-home displays, for example, that show customers pricing. But the staggering result is that adding enabling technology on top of these price-only programs on average doubles the effectiveness of the program. And here we're measuring effectiveness by reduction in peak demand. So one thing to highlight here is just that the vast majority of these programs are achieving well more than 10% reduction in peak demand, which is really huge. You can imagine the implications if you achieve 10% reduction in peak demand across your system. And in some cases, automation is tripling, quadrupling that response. So let me dive in just a little bit into what an automated solution specifically might look like. Our recommended solution tends to revolve around a Wi-Fi thermostat, and that can either be direct installed by the utility, or you can look at the emerging trend of bring your own device where customers have purchased their own Wi-Fi thermostat. On top of the thermostat, you have lots of options. You can introduce a user portal that lets the customer, that's utility branded and lets the customer access their thermostat, adjust their settings, etc. But also coaches the customer through programming that device to respond to price events. And that goes back to the value I talked about a couple of slides ago, which makes this a really valuable capacity resource. You can see which customers have programmed their devices in which ways. And so you know, for example, when you call a CPP event, what kind of load response you're going to get. In addition, from the customer side, there's lots of avenues here to stay engaged with your customer and to drive customer satisfaction. So by having a device in the home combined with meter data, combined with data you already have about the customer, demographic data, etc., you can provide really, really insightful, relevant, and customized tips to these customers delivered through an interface that they're already using, i.e. their thermostat portal. So you might analyze a customer's data and see that they have an opportunity to slightly adjust their thermostat settings and save a certain amount of money, which you can estimate specifically. You feed that tip to the customer and suggest, hey, let me adjust your settings on your thermostat by a couple of degrees, and you could save $150 this month. May I implement this automatically? Yes or no, or do you want to try it for 2 weeks? Those are just examples of the kind of tips that you can feed, but it can be really powerful and more targeted and insightful than your standard tips that are fed without consideration of an individual customer's characteristics. So the solution obviously can be adapted also for those customers who don't have central air conditioning and wouldn't be focused on a thermostat. There's still lots of potential to use a portal interface with them and provide useful behavioral tips to them to modify their consumption patterns to save money and energy on a time of use rate. So switching gears a little bit here, I want to highlight a few myths that prevail around cost-reflective pricing. And the first I want to highlight is that cost-reflective pricing necessarily erodes a utility's earnings. You know, this is kind of a prevailing challenge with demand response, in that to the extent you erode a utility's opportunities to invest in capacity, you may be making them worse off. But the truth is that there's a lot of movement in the industry now from a regulatory perspective to remove those kinds of incentives that make utilities inclined to always invest more capital. So look to New York, as New York's reforming the energy vision proceedings, for example, where they're looking, and other states are looking at these as well, but looking at performance-based rate-making practices that will reward utilities for recruiting customers onto these sophisticated tariffs and for successfully managing that customer experience. And that can more than offset any loss in earnings from the reduced investment in capital expenditure. Next myth I want to highlight is that low-income customers tend to be adversely impacted by these types of sophisticated tariffs. The truth is that in a study commissioned by the Edison Foundation recently, 65 to 79% of low-income customers would have been better off under these cost-reflective pricing tariffs without even making behavior changes, without even shifting load, suggesting that they already have very flat load profiles. On top of that, once customers do make slight adjustments to their behavior, even more low-income customers will be better off. And beyond that, there's possibility for bill credits and other mitigating measures to help alleviate any financial burden that's created, but still preserve the marginal incentive for customers to respond to prices and benefit the system. Next myth I want to highlight is that customers don't respond to marginal prices, or that their response is very inelastic. Again, going back to Brattle's database of trials, which includes a large array of tests, including pricing structures that aren't even all that granular and tied to cost. But still, in 60% of these tests, they achieved a peak reduction of greater than 10%. Again, a very large reduction if scaled system-wide. Final myth that I want to highlight is that territory-wide AMI is a prerequisite for introducing cost-reflective pricing. We at Converge work with a client who does not have territory-wide AMI, but instead, when customers enroll into their time-of-use critical peak pricing program, we install a meter at that home cost-effectively and communicate with that meter over the customer's broadband connection. And so this can be expanded to apply at other utilities as well. So moving on from myths, why is now the time that you should be considering these price-based demand response programs or these cost-reflective pricing tariffs? And I want to highlight 4 trends that suggest it's a rather urgent issue. The first is distributed energy resources emerging on the grid. So as customers are starting to purchase these solar panels, storage, batteries at their premise, it's important to set the incentives right at the outset for them to make wise decisions that will benefit the customer financially and also help reduce costs on the grid, or at least not contribute greater problems to the grid. So a simple example is a customer deciding how to orient his or her solar panels. Right now, under the prevailing net metering paradigm, the incentive is to maximize kilowatt-hour output from a set of solar panels, and that might suggest facing your panels southward, for example, to capture maximum sunlight. But perhaps a customer on real-time pricing would recognize the increased value of output during system peak conditions and might orient their panels westward, for example, to capture more sun in the late afternoon and coincide to peak. So that's just an example. You can think of lots of applications, I'm sure. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's the fairness issue too. As certain customers with DERs are essentially moving to net zero energy consumption, they're right now under the prevailing kilowatt-hour paradigm, avoiding contributing any cost to the grid. And so moving to more of a cost-based structure can help alleviate that. I know that's a controversial topic that's receiving lots of coverage right now, but an interesting thing to think about. The next trend I want to highlight is that more and more loads are wirelessly connected today than ever. Wi-Fi thermostats are growing in popularity in the marketplace. Other appliances are starting to be connected. Electric vehicles are emerging all over the grid. And so this provides an opportunity for customers to respond more easily to price because they already have a lot of automation equipment in their home. Next trend is AMI proliferation. We talked on the last slide about how AMI is not a prerequisite for these types of tariffs, but it certainly can help drive the cost effectiveness of programs if you already have AMI in place. And it can help realize a lot of the value that was foreseen for AMI when it was rolled out. The final factor I want to highlight is that customers are more digitally engaged now than they have been in the past. That will mean they're more open to the technologies, the automation technologies, and they're more easy to communicate with, especially in real time, about these rate structures. If you don't believe me, from those trends, all you really need to do today is look to the news to see that cost-reflective pricing is on the up and up. California, for example, has moved to put all residential customers by default on time of use rates by the year 2019. So let me quickly recap before I turn it over to David. Really, this whole concept of price-based demand response or cost-reflective pricing is all about aligning the pricing structure that customers face with the cost structure that a utility face, which drives a few really key benefits, which is overall a more efficient system with reduced cost to serve, more customer control and ways to save money, and of course more fairness in terms of cost allocation. There's lots of options for these cost-reflective pricing toolboxes in the cost-reflective pricing toolbox, and you can pick and choose and combine and find what's appropriate for your own particular service territory and customers. But ultimately, remember that price-based demand response programs can be made much more effective through engagement with customers and through automation, especially around thermostats with engagement portals that can drive appropriate coaching and just making price response easier for customers. I think in the end, as we move to these types of rates, really the end goal will be full automation and to drive exceptional customer satisfaction with these programs. So with that, let me wrap up and let me pass the floor to David.
Thank you, Evan. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I love to talk about Energy Select. I think that's obvious from the folks that know me, but if you look at the title of this, I was sitting here thinking maybe I titled this wrong. Maybe it should be Energy Select Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. But I want to start off by talking a little bit about the evolution of Energy Select. And believe it or not, we really started a long, long time ago, back in the 80s, as a matter of fact, with a concept called TransText. And it combined pricing and automation and different devices for thermostats and water heaters and so on and so forth, because we believe that unlike the popular belief that the price of electricity was inelastic, we felt like it was elastic. And believe it or not, that was one of the big hurdles that we had to overcome with the Public Service Commission, because again, everybody had bought electricity on the residential market at a flat rate forever. So why wouldn't it continue like that? But we felt otherwise, and we were able to definitively prove that and come up with very good customer-pleasing results from that. So after some time analyzing results of the pilot that lasted 2 years and going through the RFP process, we selected a vendor. And in 1999, Converge acquired the Control Systems Division from Scientific Atlanta, and then in 2000, Good Sense Select, which is how the program was first marketed, it was launched. And then we had a name change, and through those first 9 years of the program, we had a technology that was paging out to the gateway and telephone recall back. And as I'm sure many of you will acknowledge now, landlines are going away. So that really impacted our program. And so we had to kind of go through a self-evaluation and a reinvention of the program, and that's when we launched broadband. But I will say that the objectives of the program, whether we're talking about the days when we piloted, the days when we had the main gate home system, which was the system I just talked about, to the broadband system today, or the direct link program that we're going to be going to in April. The objectives of the program have remained the same, and they're very similar to what some of the stuff that Evan's already talked about. You know, let's see what we can do to reduce the need for future generation, and we've got this capacity out here. Can we better utilize it? And what impact does a program like this have on customer satisfaction and value? And not only does Energy Select meet those objectives, we've consistently got very good results through the years, regardless of the generation of equipment we're talking about, to all of those questions. And with that, I would say that Energy Select is as much a concept as it is devices. Probably more so a concept than devices, because the devices can change, they come and go, technology changes. But the essential or the central message that we're providing has stayed the same, and I see it changing the same. I would stay the same. In essence, with Energy Select, there are 4 primary elements of the system. There's the thermostat, there's the rate, there's the communications module that facilitates communication within the home, and then there's an online portal to do programming and whatnot. And while all 4 of those things are obviously very important, I want to concentrate on 2 today that I think are absolutely essential to making a program like this work and work successfully. Now, the first of those is the rate. Can't emphasize enough how important a good rate design is. A couple of things that I think are significant and need to be remembered is that, like Evan showed, you can get very complex with pricing. And we believe that if you're dealing with the masses, you're better off making it as simple as possible. And so, you have to face the challenge of, how do I make something complex simple? And part of the way that we've done that is the rate design itself. Though it has 4 tiers, 3 of those are predetermined. A customer has, the customer knows, because we send out materials, marketing materials, refrigerator magnets, things like that, that will let a customer know at any given time of the day what pricing tier they're under. In essence, that's a schedule. We all understand schedules. We know how to respond to schedules. So the combination of not overcomplicating the pricing structure with providing a structure, a schedule, I think does a great job of taking a lot of the complexity out of the program for customers. So 2 of the prices, the low and the medium price, are standard, are lower than the base charge, the standard residential rate, 87% of the time. So customers have the opportunity to save, even if they don't really do anything to change. The price during those time periods is lower. Now, I will say that the rate structure overall is designed to be neutral, but we know that given the chance, customers respond. So there's a real opportunity to save, and save pretty significantly on the price that they're paying for electricity. Now, there's the fourth element, which is the critical peak portion of this. It is significantly higher than the standard residential rate, and customers, in effect, use that as an on-off switch. They know exactly what they want their system to do or how they want it to operate should they get the pricing signal. And herein comes to the next element, which is online programming. But really what this is automation. You're talking about giving customers the ability to say, this is how I want to respond in any given situation. Now, we let customers know that critical time periods are most likely to occur on the hottest summer afternoons during the week or weekdays, and they're most likely to occur in the wintertime on those cold winter weekday mornings. So that's when they're kind of expect that, but they set in a setting for their thermostat that they want the system to go to should they get a critical price event. And typically, you're talking about operating in a high price period to start with, so they've already got, they're avoiding some energy consumption or energy demand in that time period, but they know this is the time period that it's likely to occur. Customers really like the ability to do this. We have found that compared to other studies that we've seen where utilities have direct load control programs where they've got their finger on the switch and they say, now's the time we're going to get this much load, we found that we get every bit as good, maybe even better response, because customers do have control over discretionary loads as well. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we target the HVAC systems, water heating, and pool pumps as the big users, but customers will police themselves better because they're paying for every one of these kilowatt hours. So they'll go through the house, they'll turn lights off, they'll turn the dryer off, they want iron clothes, they'll turn TV off that's not being viewed. So they actually will do a better job of controlling their usage than we could in putting a switch there, just simply because they've got skin in the game. Now, the portal itself, here's a look at the existing portal, and it's just basic information. It tells you that the thermostat's there, the water heater relay is there, gives you what the outside temperature is, and just a little weather forecast. Down here you see the communication status, and it shows you that your devices are connected because you got a green light on all of those. Now, as far as programming, there's a couple of ways to do it. You can either go in and say, hey, I've got prices here, or price periods with these prices. This is how I want my air conditioner to run, or this is the setting that I want it to operate on in these price periods. Same thing for heating. Or I could go in and say, I want to do this by time periods because I get up in the morning at a certain time, I leave for work, I arrive home in the evening, and then I go to bed. So, they could say, okay, I get up at 4:30, I want the temperature to be this. But I'm going to leave for the day at 6 a.m., so I want it to go up or down accordingly, depending on whether you're heating or cooling. Same thing with the evening and night. Or you can go down in here and actually drag these bars to show when I want my price periods or my cost or my thermostat setting to be. Another thing that we provide is HVAC runtime. And we use runtime as opposed to a projection of kilowatt hours because we feel like customers can sense this a little better, and we're not doing anything with regard to trying to model cost based on particular heating, cooling, things like that. I think the important thing here to remember is that customers can go in and see, yeah, okay, it's a hotter day. I can see where my air conditioner runs more, or ran more. I can see where it's off during these time periods. I've got what the outdoor temperature is and the indoor temperature and what my set point is. So I can see all of these things pretty well, and it gives me a pretty good idea of how my energy consumption is going. We also have this feature available for water heating. So they can go in and actually see when my water heater's on, when my water heater's off. Because I think one of the things that customers get confused on is when you have an electric water heater, just because there's power available to it doesn't mean that it's actually on. It's only on when the thermostat that you've set in that water heater calls for energy, says it's time to heat the water. That's the only time that it comes on. So, I mean, you can program it to be off, but if you've got it programmed to be on, it's not going to run that entire period. Now, something that I think is significant here is that even though we thought we had done a good job with the portal and going from the ability only to program devices out of thermostat to having this, one thing that we saw was that customers really go, well, this is okay, but it really, I could do better than this with this application on my phone, so on and so forth. So we find that as consumer engagement and consumer electronics, those things start to grow, then the expectations of what we're offering grow with it. So we can no longer just do things that are good enough. We've got to do things that are going to meet competitor products and to meet customer expectations. So when I talk about the technology and whether or not technology matters, I want to quickly go over this graph. I mentioned earlier that we had an old system with a paging system out to the gateway and then a telephone response back. But when telephone lines, home landlines started going away, we started losing customers. And we had a maximum of 8,950 customers on that system about 6 years ago. And in September of 2011, we introduced the broadband technology. And as you can see from this, the broadband numbers have gone up drastically, and the total numbers have gone up. So we've got just under 16,000 customers on the program now, so that in the last 6 years, we've added really about 7,000 customers. Here's some of the results of the Energy Select program. When you talk about load shed, this is what we have seen pretty consistently over the life of the program. You get very good summer and winter load reduction. As far as being recognized throughout the industry, we were the Power Grid International Project of the Year, Energy Efficiency and Demand Response Project of the Year in 2013. With regard to customer education, we were the recipient of this year's Smart Grid Award for Customer Education. And something else that I think is significant is that we're a two-time finalist for the Platts Global Energy Awards. The first of those was in 2001, right after Good Sense Select was launched. We were the 2013 finalist after we had launched the broadband program. So you can see there's a reinvention of the program, and evidently we did a good job with that, as recognized by our peers. And I said earlier that we're going to be transitioning to the next generation of equipment, which is the direct link software that Converge provides, hardware and software. And we're getting about we're getting over 20 megawatts of load control in the summer. So I think, we talked about yesterday, today, and tomorrow at the beginning, and I want to talk a little bit about tomorrow now. How do we see, or what do we think the future is going to look like? I think there's going to be, in the foreseeable future, a demand for what I'll call the traditional Energy Select customers, which are those customers that want somebody to come in, provide this equipment, tell me how to use it, so on and so forth. I think there's going to be specialized HVAC systems that need to be controlled, and we need to be able to reach that market. And the other way to do this, I think, is through the bring your own device technology, which enables you to communicate through the cloud. And I think that's going to be a game changer with regard to the ability to reach more and more customers. And why is that important? It's really important because it has a very significant potential impact on program costs. It's going to make this much more easy to provide it to a bigger base of customers, And again, customers are going to get that sense of control or skin in the game with this. Now, this is kind of, I think, a no-brainer, but it's important, I think, sometimes to answer those questions that are obvious. And you want to change because change is going to happen. If you sit back and rest on your laurels and say, okay, we've done a good job, we've got this award or we got that award, that's all well and good, but it's not going to prepare you for tomorrow. And you really can't allow yesterday's successes to dictate what's going to happen tomorrow, because if you do that, you're going to miss the boat. It's how you respond to the change that is coming is going to determine whether or not you stay relevant, or whether you're a success or whether you're a failure. With that in mind, you have to stay relevant. Evan talked about that. I think he's right on board. You do that through a continuous reevaluation or reinvention of what you're doing. I think the key to that is consistency. So you might say, wait a minute, you just said I got to reinvent myself, so how can I be consistent in doing that? Well, I'm not talking about the devices or what exactly it looks like. What I'm talking about is if you go back to the reasons you're doing the programs, the objectives that you've set, if you focus on customer value and the continued development and growth of the program, that's what I'm talking about in consistency. And I think those are the things that are central to making sure that your success perpetuates itself into the future. I think you continue to do what you do well. You may have to do it a little differently, but those are the things that you want to focus on. And you need to let technology help you do what you do better. We've seen much change over the 25 years that we've been talking about this program to where we are today. And I think the key to that is that we've embraced that technology change and looked at that and said, hey, this is going to solve some problems that we've seen before. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Evan for questions.
Thank you, David. And thanks to everyone who submitted questions. We got quite a few, and we've only got about 5 minutes left in our session. So we'll address a couple here. If we don't get to your question, we'll follow up with you personally by email soon. But David, let me kick a question to you first. What approach do you guys take to setting the prices in your program, both for the critical peaks and for the different time periods?
Well, the rate design itself is such that the price in that period, those predetermined periods and the critical event, are based on an approximation of what our costs are during those periods. Now, when we call an event, that's generally determined by one of 2 or 3 types of things. Do we have a system alert? Is there an emergency that we've got to take care of? What's our system lambda? Or what's the actual real-time cost of electricity during that period? We've got a threshold there where we say, if we exceed this, we need to call a critical. Typically, those types of things coincide with what the weather patterns are. So, what we end up seeing is that the times that we call for a critical event, it's very close to a time when we're going to have setting a peak anyway. And I think one thing that's important to realize about that is that customers understand the weather a whole lot more than they understand a lot of these things that we know go behind the scenes.
Thanks. We got another question that I'll try to address. Question was, for many utilities, DR often means a button that allows predictable load to be shed in a matter of minutes. How do you reconcile pricing models, even with coaching, with the need to shed load quickly? And I think I touched on that a little bit in the presentation, and you did too, David, but that's where automation proves extremely valuable. If you can see the settings that customers have on their thermostat in terms of price response, that is essentially as operationally valuable and as predictable as the type of traditional direct load control program where customers have an option to opt out. Would you agree, David?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, kick one back to you. This is a 2-part question. What are the metrics that you guys use to measure success? And expand a little bit on your interactions with your regulator in terms of getting this program approved and continuing it.
Okay. With regard to regulators, the program is evaluated based on whether or not it passes the rate impact measure. And if it does, then we can recover weather-sensitive, the cost of weather-sensitive program. With regard to how we ourselves evaluate the success of the program, it's basically in customer growth, customer satisfaction, and then the ability to stay relevant in the marketplace. Those are the types of things that we use to evaluate how successful we are.
Okay, thanks. Got a few questions also about customers wanting to enroll their own Wi-Fi devices into your program. Can you comment on that a little bit, other thermostats? I think you touched on it in your presentation, but maybe elaborate just a little bit.
Yes, we believe that's the future. I know there's a lot of talk about Nest right now. That's one of those things that we believe that in time will be able to be incorporated into this program. I don't want to get too deep into it, but one of the hurdles to really providing a lot of off-the-shelf stuff was the fact that they didn't speak the same language, so it's a different protocol. By enabling a cloud-based interaction between devices as opposed to a point-to-point piece of hardware, I think those things are going to be able to be solved. And we've got systems now. We're going from what currently on the broadband system is a Zigbee-enabled local area network to Wi-Fi that's going to be in the direct link product. And I think with the addition of Wi-Fi into this program and the emergence of Wi-Fi technology and products and thermostats and in water heaters and all kinds of appliances throughout the house, I think it really broadens up and really enables even greater success of the program.
Great. Thanks, David. Really appreciate you joining us today, and thanks to everyone else who dialed in and submitted questions. Apologies, we've got several more on the list, but like I said, we're short on time, so we will follow up with you folks directly if we didn't get to your question. So thanks again. Let me pass it back to PJ.
Thank you. Great job, speakers. Fantastic presentation. For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. As you log off, please take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so we can continue to provide you with quality content. Thank you for attending, and this does conclude today's presentation.